The summer of 1944 had turned the quiet countryside of France into one of the most chaotic landscapes the world had ever seen. Villages once known for orchards, vineyards, and cobblestone streets now lay torn apart by the thunder of tanks, the crack of artillery, and the restless movement of men marching eastward. For the Allies, the landings in Normandy had been the greatest gamble of the war, Operation Overlord, the mighty D-Day invasion. Against all odds, the gamble had succeeded. The beaches had been secured, and the German defenses, so deeply entrenched and feared, had begun to crumble. Yet as the Allies pushed deeper into occupied France, a new and unexpected enemy rose to challenge them, an enemy that no soldier could shoot or bomb into submission. That enemy was fuel, or more accurately, the lack of it. War, as every general knows, is not only won by men with rifles or tanks with cannons. It is won by supplies, food, ammunition, spare parts, and above all, gasoline. Without it, armies become paralyzed steel beasts, stranded on the roads like corpses in a graveyard of ambition. The German generals, watching from their bunkers and command posts, understood this truth with almost cruel clarity. They had faced similar nightmares on the Eastern Front, where vast distances devoured fuel faster than it could be delivered. And now, as they watched American tanks and trucks surge across France with astonishing speed, they laughed bitterly to themselves. Surely, they thought, the Americans would choke on their own success. Their supply lines were too long, their appetite for gasoline too great. Sooner or later, the unstoppable Patton would stop, not because of German bullets, but because his tanks would run dry. George S. Patton, the flamboyant, relentless commander of the U.S. Third Army, embodied speed and aggression. He demanded that his men move fast, strike hard, and never give the enemy a moment to breathe. In August of 1944, his army broke through the German lines and swept across the French countryside with a ferocity that stunned both friend and foe. Villages were liberated by the hour, towns fell by the day, and German forces found themselves retreating faster than they could regroup. Patton was fulfilling his dream of modern warfare, a rolling blitzkrieg powered by American ingenuity. But behind this dramatic advance, a darker reality loomed. His tanks guzzled fuel at an unimaginable rate, up to 400,000 gallons of gasoline a day. Every mile forward stretched the supply lines thinner, every town captured pushed the depots farther away. Soon, the front lines were moving faster than the trucks could deliver. In the high halls of Berlin, German commanders seized on this weakness with grim satisfaction. They had underestimated the Americans before, scoffing at their assembly line soldiers and civilian generals. But now, they believed time and logistics would do the work that their battered armies could not. The Americans were racing toward disaster. Without fuel, their machines would halt, their morale would waver, and their offensive momentum would wither away. The Germans could regroup, reinforce, and perhaps even strike back. The battlefield, it seemed, would soon favor the defenders once more. But the Americans were not as naive as their enemies believed. Deep within the Allied command structure, planners and logisticians understood the severity of the crisis. The ports in Normandy were too small, the great harbor of Cherbourg too damaged to handle the massive tonnage of supplies pouring in from the United States and Britain. The solution had been Operation Mulberry, artificial harbors built to unload ships directly onto the beaches, but even these marvels of engineering had their limits. Every day, millions of gallons of fuel had to be unloaded, stored, and then transported hundreds of miles by truck to keep the armored spearheads alive. If the flow stopped, the advance stopped. And if the advance stopped, the war itself would drag on, costing thousands more lives. Patton himself had no patience for delay. He pressed Eisenhower and Bradley for more fuel, demanding that his Third Army be given priority over Montgomery's forces to the north. His argument was simple. With fuel, he could reach the German border before winter. Without it, he would be forced to slow down, and the enemy would recover. But Eisenhower, tasked with balancing the needs of all Allied armies, could not simply hand over everything to Patton. Supplies had to be shared, and the pie was never big enough. The tension among the generals grew, but the true solution would not come from strategy rooms or heated arguments. It would come from an extraordinary effort. a gamble of logistics that would push ordinary soldiers into extraordinary circumstances. It was called the Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system improvised under the pressure of necessity, designed to keep the fuel and supplies flowing to the front. The idea was radical: take thousands of trucks, man them with soldiers, many of whom were young, inexperienced, or assigned from support units, and put them on a relentless schedule, driving day and night along designated routes. These trucks would become the lifeline of the Allied advance, the invisible arteries pumping gasoline, ammunition, and food into the beating heart of Patton's army. It was a solution born of desperation, but one that would become legendary. At first, many doubted it could succeed. The roads of France were narrow and winding, often clogged with refugees and the wreckage of war. German planes still prowled the skies, looking for easy prey. Bridges had been destroyed, rivers flooded, and villages reduced to rubble. How could thousands of trucks possibly sustain an army moving at such breathtaking speed? Even among the Allies, there were whispers that the plan was madness, that the Red Ball Express would collapse under its own weight. The Germans, hearing rumors of it, scoffed again. Trucks and fuel could not win wars, they thought. Only men and guns. Yet as the days turned into weeks, the convoys rolled on. Soldiers who had never expected to see combat found themselves behind the wheel of trucks that became as important as any Sherman tank or P-51 fighter plane. They drove through mud, through darkness, through the constant threat of ambush. They pushed their vehicles to the breaking point, engines roaring, tires shredding, suspensions groaning under impossible loads. But they delivered. Every gallon of fuel that reached Patton's tanks carried with it the hope of victory. Every truck that rumbled into the horizon became another nail in the coffin of German confidence. Still, in those early weeks, nothing was certain. The Germans were retreating, but they were not broken. Patton was advancing, but his fuel depots were dangerously thin. The Red Ball Express was running, but it had not yet proven it could outpace the insatiable appetite of modern mechanized war. The stage was set for a clash not only of armies, but of endurance. Could American logistics sustain the momentum of liberation, or would the skeptics be proven right? In the shadow of ruined villages and smoldering fields, the answer had yet to reveal itself. The fate of Patton's Blitz, and perhaps the fate of the war in Europe, hung in the balance. The first convoys of the Red Ball Express began rolling on August 25, 1944, just weeks after the breakout from Normandy. The name itself came from railroad slang, where a red ball signified a priority express shipment that had to reach its destination at all costs. For the men who climbed into the driver's seats of the trucks, the mission was simple: deliver fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts to the front lines as fast as humanly possible. But what sounded simple on paper became a punishing, relentless ordeal on the war-torn roads of France. Day and night. Convoys stretched for miles, sometimes more than 100 trucks long. Their headlights often blacked out to avoid attracting German aircraft. Dust rose from the dirt roads like a constant shroud, choking the drivers and clogging engines. Rain turned the routes into rivers of mud, where trucks slid into ditches and had to be pulled free by their comrades. Mechanical breakdowns were constant, but turning back was not an option. Every driver knew that Patton's Third Army and much of the Allied advance depended on them. The designated route system was ingenious. Two main highways were cleared exclusively for the convoys. One road dedicated entirely to trucks heading to the front, the other for those returning empty. No civilian traffic, no military vehicles outside the system, only the lifeblood of fuel and supplies. Signs marked with a bright red ball directed the drivers where to go, ensuring no delays and no confusion. Military police manned intersections to keep the path clear, and priority status meant nothing could interfere with the rolling lifeline. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks, most of them 2.5-ton GMC deuce-and-a-half cargo haulers. Together, they consumed almost as much gasoline as they delivered, an irony not lost on the men who drove them. Every day, more than 12,000 tons of supplies thundered forward toward Patton's tanks, the logistical equivalent of a miracle. The Germans, who had prided themselves on blitzkrieg, could scarcely believe the scale of what the Americans had built in such a short time. Yet the system came at an enormous human cost. Most of the drivers were young and inexperienced. Many were African-American soldiers drawn from service and support units. The U.S. Army at that time was still segregated, and black soldiers were rarely given the chance to serve in frontline combat roles. But in the Red Ball Express, they found themselves carrying one of the most dangerous and vital assignments of the war. Nearly 75% of all Red Ball drivers were African American, and their contributions became the backbone of the operation. These men drove for 16 to 20 hours a day, often with little sleep, often under fire. German fighter planes strafed convoys, artillery sometimes bracketed the roads, and snipers lurked in forests. But the drivers pressed on. Their courage and endurance often overlooked in the headlines of battle, yet absolutely essential to victory. The convoys were not immune to chaos. Trucks broke down by the dozens, their engines overheating, tires shredding, and axles snapping under the strain. Mechanics worked in muddy fields and roadside ditches, patching together vehicles with whatever spare parts could be scavenged. Drivers improvised constantly, replacing blown gaskets with strips of cloth, siphoning fuel from wrecked trucks, even using wood to reinforce broken suspension. The men joked grimly that the trucks were held together with prayer and desperation. Some of the stories that emerged from the Red Ball Express defied belief. Drivers raced through pitch-black nights without headlights, following the faint glow of the truck ahead and praying it did not veer off the road. Convoys sometimes pushed for more than 400 miles in a single run, the drivers chewing coffee grounds or smoking endlessly just to stay awake. A few tied string from the steering wheel to their wrists, so the sudden tug would jolt them awake if they nodded off. And through it all, they carried thousands upon thousands of 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline, stacked high and strapped precariously to the backs of their trucks. One stray bullet, one spark, could turn an entire convoy into a rolling inferno. Still, the drivers delivered. One soldier later recalled, "If Patton wanted gas, we got it to him. We didn't ask how. We just drove until the tanks were full." And Patton's tanks were full, enough to keep them moving at a pace that astonished even his allies. Entire German divisions collapsed under the relentless pursuit. The liberation of Paris, the rapid drive to the Seine, and the encirclement of retreating German armies at the Falaise Pocket all owed their momentum not only to Patton's daring leadership, but to the endless stream of fuel flowing from the Red Ball Express. German generals, watching from their headquarters, began to realize their mistake. They had laughed at the Americans, certain that their logistics would fail. Now they watched with dismay as convoys of trucks kept the U.S. Third Army moving at a tempo the Wehrmacht could not match. A captured German officer, when asked about Patton's advance, admitted bitterly, "We thought you had discovered perpetual motion." What the Germans had failed to grasp was that American industry, combined with the sheer determination of ordinary soldiers, had created a logistical machine unlike anything seen in history. But success did not come without cracks. The Red Ball Express was an extraordinary improvisation, but it was also unsustainable. Trucks burned through their engines in weeks instead of months. Spare parts ran out. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies pushed past human limits. Fuel was delivered, but at a staggering cost in manpower and machinery. By late September, as the Allied advance slowed at the German border, the system was stretched to the breaking point. Supplies could no longer keep pace with the speed of the armies, and the reality of logistics began to catch up with Patton's dreams. Yet for those critical weeks, the Red Ball Express had achieved the impossible. It had allowed the Allies to exploit the breakout from Normandy, to push the Germans out of France, and to keep the war moving forward at a pace that denied the enemy the chance to recover. The drivers became unsung heroes, their faces smeared with dust, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their nerves frayed by constant danger. They did not fight with rifles, but their battle was every bit as vital. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Red Ball Express was how little recognition it received at the time. Newspapers wrote about Patton's daring, about the liberation of cities, about the battles that shaped the headlines. Few words were spared for the endless lines of trucks and the men who drove them. Yet every soldier at the front knew the truth. Without the Red Ball Express, the advance would have faltered, the tanks would have stopped, and the war might have taken a far darker turn. And so, in the late summer of 1944, as Patton's army thundered toward the German border, the fate of Europe rolled forward not only on steel tracks and tank treads, but on rubber tires and weary hands gripping the wheel. The Germans had laughed at American logistics. But in the dust of France, in the roar of thousands of overworked engines, that laughter was beginning to die. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express had become legend. For 5 weeks it had thundered across France, moving day and night without pause, sustaining the Allied armies in their greatest surge of the war. But like all miracles, it came at a price. The trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. The convoys burned almost as much fuel as they carried, and the German border loomed ahead like a stone wall. The Americans had reached the limit of what trucks alone could accomplish. Logistics, the invisible giant that had fueled the Blitz, now began to dictate the rhythm of battle once again. For George Patton, the slowdown was agony. He had dreamed of smashing across the Rhine before winter, of driving his tanks deep into the German heartland while the enemy reeled. "My men can eat their belts," he once barked, "but my tanks have got to have gas." Yet even he could not bend the laws of supply. The Red Ball Express had given him speed, but it could not defeat distance. Each mile further east stretched the supply lines thinner. Each day demanded more trucks, more drivers, more gasoline than could be found. The offensive that had raced across France now slowed to a crawl. In Berlin, German generals breathed a sigh of relief. The nightmare of perpetual American motion had ended. Their armies, though battered, were given time to regroup behind the Siegfried Line, the massive defensive belt guarding Germany's western frontier. Yet the Germans could not erase what had happened. They had mocked American logistics, believing the U.S. Army too inexperienced, too clumsy, too wasteful to sustain a modern blitz. Instead, they had watched an improvised convoy system humiliate their predictions and carry the Allies hundreds of miles across Europe in a matter of weeks. The laughter of summer had turned to silence in autumn, and still, even as the Red Ball Express began to wind down, its legacy grew. By the time the operation officially ended on November 16, 1944, its convoys had hauled more than 400,000 tons of supplies. The numbers were staggering. 6,000 trucks in constant motion, more than 23,000 drivers, many of them African-American soldiers who had never before been trusted with such responsibility. These men, once confined to labor battalions and menial tasks, had now carried the Allied war effort on their shoulders. Their skill, courage, and sacrifice had proved that the American Army's strength was not just in tanks and bombers, but in the diversity and determination of its soldiers. Some historians would later call the Red Ball Express one of the greatest feats of logistics in military history. Others would point out its flaws, its inefficiency, its strain, its temporary nature. But none could deny its impact. Without it, the advance across France would have faltered. Without it, Patton's Third Army would have stalled far earlier, giving the Germans precious time to recover. Without it, the liberation of Paris and the swift push to the German frontier might never have happened. And for the men who drove the convoys, the memories never faded. They remembered the endless lines of trucks, the engines screaming in protest, the clouds of dust that coated everything. They remembered the fear of German strafing runs, the terror of driving blackout roads where one wrong turn meant death. They remembered pulling wrecked trucks out of ditches with bare hands, or patching broken engines with scraps of wire and luck. They remembered comrades lost to accidents, to fatigue, to enemy fire. Sacrifices rarely honored on war memorials, but etched forever in their own minds. There was pride, too. Pride that they had done the impossible. Pride that they had kept Patton's tanks moving when even the Germans believed it could not be done. One driver, interviewed decades later, simply said, "We knew if we didn't get that gas up there, the whole show was over. So we drove. That's all we did. We just drove." As winter closed in and the Red Ball Express gave way to more permanent supply systems, railroads, repaired ports, pipelines, the convoys faded from the headlines. The focus shifted to the battles ahead, the struggle for the Hürtgen Forest, the Ardennes offensive, the crossing of the Rhine. But the story of the Red Ball Express remained a quiet reminder of a truth as old as war itself. Victories are not won only by those who fight at the front, but by those who make it possible for them to fight at all. For the German generals who had laughed, the lesson was bitter. They had mocked American soldiers as soft, American industry as wasteful, American commanders as reckless. Yet they had underestimated the one thing America possessed in abundance, the power to move mountains of supplies across oceans and then across continents. They had underestimated the ordinary soldier, the truck driver with grease on his hands and no weapon in his lap, who nonetheless carried victory mile after mile. In the final analysis, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy system. It was a symbol of what modern war demanded: mobility, endurance, and above all, logistics. It proved that wars are not decided only by strategy or courage, but by the relentless grind of keeping armies fed, fueled, and supplied. It showed that the difference between triumph and disaster could be measured in gallons of gasoline and miles of asphalt, and so, when the history of World War II is told, the Red Ball Express deserves its place alongside the great battles and daring commanders. For in those weeks of 1944, as Europe trembled and the fate of nations hung in the balance, it was not only the thunder of Patton's tanks that shaped the outcome, but the rumble of thousands of weary trucks, their drivers gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, carrying with them the fuel of victory. The Germans laughed at U.S. logistics, but when the Red Ball Express roared through the night, mile after mile, ton after ton, their laughter faded into silence. And in that silence, the sound of American engines told a story the world would never forget.